Welcome, weary traveler of the night, to another quiet voyage through the corridors of history. Tonight, we drift into a mystery older than memory itself. Before names were given to lands, before maps carved borders into the earth, there were souls who listened to the sea, not as wanderers, but as witnesses to promise. Steady your breath. Let the hour soften. What follows is not a lesson, but a remembrance whispered to the dark, a story meant not to be seen, but felt. Somewhere within that dark, there are histories not erased, only lowered into silence. Histories the world chose to forget, but that have never fully slept. There are histories that are not erased, only lowered into silence. Among the sealed ledgers of forgotten orders, beneath the dust of suppressed voyages and condemned symbols, there persists a murmur that the new world was known before it was named, crossed before it was claimed, and guarded before it was revealed. They were men sworn not merely to faith, but to secrecy itself. Warrior monks whose vows bound them tighter than chains, whose knowledge traveled ahead of kings and crowns. The Order of the Temple, remembered for crusades, condemned for heresy, and executed for knowing too much. When their order fell beneath royal command and ecclesiastical fire, their ships vanished. Their treasuries dissolved. Their maps never recovered. Yet stone carvings remain where no Europeans were meant to stand. Crosses cut into cliffs that face a western sea. Coins buried far from Christendom. Legends among coastal peoples of pale-robed men who arrived without conquest and left without trace. This is not the story of discovery. It is the story of arrival without announcement, of landfall without proclamation, of a world encountered and then returned to silence. Tonight, we follow the quieter current, not to prove but to listen. If these words stir something familiar within you, remain here and walk gently with us along the hidden path. The story does not begin with a ship, but with absence. It begins in the ledgers that fall suddenly quiet, in the margins where ink thins and intention withdraws. In the final decades of the Knights of the Temple, the ports of Europe grow strangely mute. Names are written, then left unfinished. Destinations are implied, then withheld. Vessels are recorded as departing, yet no hand returns to record their arrival. What remains is not confusion, but restraint. Harbors along the Atlantic edge feel this change first. La Rochelle, Porto, Lisbon, small coves where the sea breathes close to stone. Dockmasters note hulls stocked beyond necessity. Sailcloth ordered in quantities that suggest long passage. Water casks sealed with care as if time itself were to be crossed. Yet when asked, the brothers offer no explanation. Silence becomes their answer, and silence is accepted. The atmosphere is heavy with closing walls. Kings grow impatient. Debts once tolerated are suddenly remembered. Messengers ride with sharpened words. Within the church, whispers begin to circulate, not accusations yet, but suspicions dressed as concern. The order listens. The order understands. And still, they do not scatter inland, nor do they flee east toward familiar sanctuaries. Their attention turns instead toward the horizon that most fear to name. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules lies the Sea of Darkness, a place of legend and warning, a water without promise, said to swallow ships and unmake stars. Few captains dare its breath, fewer return with reason intact. But the Templars are not few, and they are not unprepared. Their commanderies along the western coast change quietly. Walls are reinforced not against siege, but against observation. Shipyards expand under the guise of repair. Tools appear that belong more to navigators than monks. Astrolabes rest in stone cloisters that claim no need of the heavens. Star charts are copied, then locked away. The brothers speak less, and when they do, it is in fragments. Not plans, but confirmations. Not questions, but acknowledgments. As if the path ahead were already known and discussion would only profane it. No chronicle states why this preparation occurs. No papal letter records concern. No royal decree forbids it, and yet the absence itself speaks. This is not an order seeking escape. This is an order remembering an obligation. The place emerges before the journey. A westward orientation settles into the life of the temple like a vow renewed. Prayers linger longer at dusk, facing the dying light. Maps are unrolled without commentary, studied, then rolled again. Certain coastlines are traced with a finger and then deliberately avoided. The brothers understand that to speak of a thing is to expose it. Something had already been told to them. Perhaps a rumor carried back from the east, from deserts where older civilizations sleep beneath sand. Perhaps a fragment uncovered beneath the ruins of Solomon's temple, a memory pressed into stone and waiting for the right hands. Perhaps a map without names, showing land not claimed, not crowned, not cursed. And so the temple prepares, not as explorers hungry for renown, but as guardians bound by silence. They ready themselves not to discover but to return, to stand again where they have stood before, though the world has forgotten. The answer is not written because writing endures. Instead, it is carried in posture, in the way the brothers walk the cloisters more slowly, as if time itself were listening. Bells ring at familiar hours, yet feel altered, as though counting down rather than calling forward. Even the sea seems to wait, holding its breath against the shore. Somewhere beyond sight, beyond permission, something remains unfinished. And the order, long trained to keep watch over thresholds, senses that the door once opened has never truly closed. They do not hurry. They do not mourn. They trust the interval. For what is guarded must never be rushed, and what is remembered must be approached with reverence. The West waits, unnamed and unclaimed, breathing softly into the dark. This silence is the first sign something sacred remains hidden. Silence, once accepted, becomes a discipline. Within the order of the temple, it deepens into ritual. The brothers learn to move without echo, to speak without leaving residue. What is not written cannot be seized. What is not proclaimed cannot be condemned. And so the preparation continues beneath a veil of ordinary devotion. From the outside, the commanderies appear unchanged. Prayers are sung. Candles are lit. Alms are given. Yet beneath this surface, patterns shift. Supplies arrive at hours when witnesses are few. Ships are blessed without ceremony, as if blessing itself might draw attention. Even the winds seem consulted, their cycles noted with care. The Templars are no longer living within the calendar of Christendom. They are listening to an older rhythm. The westward gaze sharpens. Brothers stand along cliffs at dusk, not in contemplation but in recognition. The sea is not unknown to them. It is familiar in the way a dream is familiar, never fully remembered yet never doubted. They watch how the sun descends, where it hesitates, where it vanishes. These details are shared quietly, not as discoveries, but as confirmations long expected. In monasteries far from the coast, objects change hands. A compass here, a sealed scroll there, relics that do not belong to saints but to places. Stones etched with marks that resemble letters from no known tongue. When questioned, the keepers of these items respond with prayer and the questions dissolve. The church is accustomed to mystery. It does not yet sense danger, but the pressure builds. Rumors thicken. A king's patience thins. The Templars feel the approach of scrutiny like a storm felt in the bones before clouds gather, and still they do not abandon their course. The east holds interrogation. The north holds exile. The south holds conflict. Only the West holds silence vast enough to receive what must be carried. No single leader commands this movement. That is its strength. The knowledge does not sit in one mind nor in one vault. It is distributed, layered, protected by redundancy. Each brother knows only what he must. Together they form a memory larger than any confession could unravel. Letters are written and destroyed. Routes are planned and altered. Names of ships are changed more than once. What matters is not the vessel but the moment of departure. Timing becomes sacred. They wait for tides that align not only with the moon but with circumstance. The disappearance must feel natural, unremarkable, as though nothing at all has occurred. At La Rochelle, the great harbor breathes as it always has. Merchants argue, fishermen curse their nets. And in the midst of this noise, a small fleet prepares to leave without fanfare. No banners fly, no crowds gather. The brothers board as they always have, heads lowered, cloaks unadorned. To an untrained eye, it is an ordinary passage. To those who know, it is a crossing. The sea of darkness does not frighten them. Fear belongs to those who seek conquest. The Templars seek custody. They have been entrusted, though by whom they do not always say. Some whisper of instructions passed down from the earliest days of the order, when the Temple Mount yielded more than rubble. Others believe the call came later, carried by traders who spoke of lands beyond the sunset, where signs long described were said to exist. Whatever the source, the conviction is shared. This is not escape. This is return. The West is not a blank. It is a page written once, then folded away. The brothers carry with them not ambition, but obligation. An obligation, once accepted, does not release its hold. As the ships drift from shore, the coastline recedes without ceremony. No one waves. No one marks the moment. The bells continue to ring behind them, unaware they are ringing for absence. Ahead lies water without witness, sky without boundary, and a destination that does not yet consent to be named. The oars dip, the sails fill, and Europe slowly begins to forget what it has allowed to leave. Once beyond the sight of land, the world changes its rules. Sound thins. Direction becomes suggestion. The brothers feel this shift immediately, as though they have stepped out of recorded time. Behind them lies a continent bound by memory and authority. Ahead stretches a silence wide enough to receive what cannot remain. They do not speak of destination. To name a place is to anchor it, and anchoring is not their purpose. Instead, they observe signs. The behavior of birds that travel farther than maps allow. The color of water as it deepens, then lightens again. The stars, unburdened by familiar reference, arrange themselves into patterns known only to those who have studied older skis. Navigation is precise yet restrained. They follow routes that curve subtly, avoiding currents that would pull them into known harbors. The course feels practiced. Adjustments are small, confident, unhurried. This is not experimentation. It is recollection refined by caution. Days pass without incident. Nights stretch longer than expected. The sea of darkness proves neither violent nor forgiving. It is indifferent, and indifference to the Templars feels like permission. They pray not for protection but for discretion, that they might pass without leaving wake, that what they carry remains unseen. Within the hold are no treasures that glitter, no relics to tempt thieves. What they guard is quieter, knowledge reduced to fragments, symbols without explanation. Instructions that begin in the middle and end without conclusion. Each brother carries a portion, never the whole. Should one fail, the memory survives elsewhere. The church, had it known, would have named this heresy. The crown would have named it treason, but neither authority governs the open sea. Here only intention matters, and the intention of the temple is steady. At intervals they alter course slightly, responding to signs invisible to any outsider. A change in wind that carries a scent not of salt but of earth, a swell that rises differently as if shaped by unseen land. These moments pass without comment. Each brother notes them inwardly, adding them to a growing certainty. They are close. Landfall, when it comes, is not dramatic. No cliffs rise in greeting. No storms announce arrival. Instead, there is a subtle calming of water, a softening of the horizon. The sea exhales. Birds circle with purpose. The shoreline reveals itself gradually, as if allowing approach only after recognition. They do not rush to disembark. The ships anchor at a respectful distance. Observation precedes action. This place has endured without their presence. It must not be disturbed by haste. When they step onto unfamiliar ground, they do so lightly, leaving as little trace as possible. There are no declarations, no claims spoken aloud. The land does not need to be told it is found. It knows. What matters is acknowledgement. A stone is placed where water meets earth. A mark is made that only those who know how to see will recognize. Nothing more. They remain briefly, long enough to confirm what memory suggested, long enough to ensure what is here remains protected by obscurity. Whatever first drew the temple westward is not meant to be taken. It is meant to remain, undisturbed by crowns and crusades alike. And then, as quietly as they arrived, they withdraw. The ships turn back toward the rising sun, carrying with them not proof but responsibility. Behind them, the shore resumes its silence, unchanged to any eye that does not know what to seek. When Europe later looks west and sees only emptiness, it will not suspect what has already passed through that space. The absence will feel natural, complete, earned. Back across the sea, events are already in motion. Accusations sharpen, orders are given, the temple's days are numbered, but what has been set into motion here cannot be undone by fire or decree. The knowledge has been returned to its keeping place. The guardians have fulfilled their role. And so the chapter closes where it began, with absence. Ships that will never be accounted for. Journeys that leave no official trace. A silence so well kept it convinces the world nothing ever happened at all. Yet somewhere beyond maps and names, the land remembers the brief touch of those who came not to conquer, but to keep watch. And that memory waits, patient and undisturbed, for those who might one day listen closely enough to hear it. Objects often speak when voices are forbidden. They do so patiently, without insistence, revealing themselves only to those who know how to wait. Among the scattered remnants attributed to the Knights of the Temple, there are such objects, maps, or what survives of them. Not the proud charts unfurled before kings, but quieter skins of parchment, worn thin by careful hands, bearing marks meant to be seen only briefly. These maps do not announce themselves. They lack titles. Their corners carry no seals. Legends are absent, as though explanation itself were considered dangerous. Coastlines are drawn with confidence, yet left unnamed. Rivers press inward from the shore, bending toward interior spaces that no European chronicle acknowledges. Above them, stars are plotted with unsettling precision, aligned to skis not expected to hover over any known land. One such artifact flickers into record within a monastic inventory. It is listed without description, noted only by weight and material, then never mentioned again. Another survives only as a rumor contained in a letter, written in a hand trained for secrecy, its contents rendered in cipher and never broken. The letters endure. The meaning does not, or perhaps it endures elsewhere. The atmosphere surrounding these objects is not one of excitement but of restraint. This is not cartography as conquest. There are no bold lines claiming dominion, no flourishes meant to impress a patron. Instead, the maps feel inward-facing, as if their purpose were to guide those already bound by oath. They do not invite curiosity. They assume it has already been earned. The Western landmasses they depict resist familiar interpretation. They are not distorted reflections of Asia, nor speculative islands drawn from hearsay. Their proportions suggest lived experience. Distances feel measured rather than imagined. Mountains are placed with care, set back from the coast as if observed from approach, not conjecture. The rivers do not meander randomly. They flow with intention as though their paths were known. No crown claims these lands. No papal blessing sanctifies them. There are no heraldic marks, no declarations of ownership. These are not maps for kings, whose gaze turns every horizon into appetite. They are working tools, designed for those who do not need permission to recognize where they are. In the margins, crosses appear, but not as symbols of possession. They function instead as warnings, markers of caution, places where passage should slow or stop entirely. Some areas are circled, not emphasized, but set apart. Others are scratched out deliberately, their erasure too careful to be accidental. Forgetting here is an act, not a failure. When the arrests of the Templars begin, these maps vanish more swiftly than gold. Treasuries are catalogued. Relics are seized. Yet no inventory lists them. No trial record mentions parchment of this kind. The absence is complete, which suggests only one conclusion. They were moved, not lost. The object remains incomplete, scattered across rumor and shadow, but its absence shapes the narrative as surely as presence ever could. A map unshared is not ignorance. It is restraint practiced over generations. As this chapter opens, we begin to sense that the new world may not have awaited discovery at all. It may instead have been charted once, quietly, and then folded back into silence, where only the faithful could remember how to unfold it again. To understand a map kept hidden, one must first understand fear, not the fear of the unknown, but the fear of what becomes known too soon. Within the order of the temple, knowledge was never treated as possession. It was treated as burden, and burden, if revealed without preparation, invites ruin. The brothers who handled these parchments did so with a deliberate humility. They did not study them openly nor in large company. A single candle, a single witness, often none at all. The map would be unrolled just enough to confirm a detail, then return to its casing. Prolonged viewing was discouraged, as though memory itself might attract attention. What the maps showed was not merely geography, but consequence. Certain coastlines were marked with symbols that had no equivalent in European charting traditions. Notations were placed beside natural harbors, not to invite entry but to warn against lingering. In places where later explorers would erect forts, these maps showed hesitation. Where abundance might be expected, the margins urged restraint. The stars drawn above these lands are especially telling. They are not aligned to Mediterranean skies. Their angles suggest observation from further west, under heavens shifted just enough to betray distance. This is not speculation copied from ancient texts. It is record, made by those who stood beneath those stars and took measure of them. Some scholars, long after the order's fall, would attempt to explain these anomalies away. They would speak of copying errors, of misunderstood Arabic sources, of imaginative monks reaching beyond their learning. But such explanations falter under quiet scrutiny. Imagination hesitates. These maps do not. Each line feels deliberate. Each omission feels intentional. There is evidence, faint but persistent, that copies once existed in different commanderies, not identical but complementary. One map emphasizing coastline, another detailing inland passage, another marking celestial alignments. Together they would form a whole. Apart, they reveal nothing conclusive. Separation becomes protection. When pressure mounts, the brothers act without panic. They do not attempt to destroy the maps. Fire draws inquiry. Ash leaves residue. Instead, they redistribute. A parchment placed within a reliquary. Another stitched into the lining of a habit. One perhaps entrusted to a ship already bound westward. The church, in its interrogations, never asks the right questions. It hunts for heresy, not geography, for blasphemy, not direction. And so the maps slip through the net of accusation untouched. Their danger lies not in doctrine, but in implication. A land charted without authority threatens every authority that claims to grant legitimacy. To admit that such maps exist would be to admit that the world is larger than permission allows, that some knowledge answers to older vows than crown or altar. Letters hint at this tension. In one fragment, a brother writes of lines that must not be straightened. In another, of a coast that must remain folded. The language is careful, layered, designed to pass unnoticed. Even if intercepted, it would appear devotional rather than directional. Over time, the memory of the maps becomes more important than the maps themselves. The brothers commit their contours to heart. They learn distances by prayer, landmarks by recitation. The parchment becomes secondary. If seized, it can be denied. If remembered, it cannot be taken. This perhaps is the most unsettling realization, that by the time the order falls, the maps may already be obsolete, not because the knowledge is gone, but because it has been absorbed. The parchment is only a skin. The true chart exists elsewhere, carried by those who know how to read silence. As the pressure reaches its peak, and the world prepares to condemn the temple, the maps complete their final service. They vanish so thoroughly that later generations will doubt they ever existed at all. And doubt in this case is the final layer of protection. The absence grows heavier, not as loss but as intentional vacancy, a space left open so that history may pass over it without noticing what lies beneath. Somewhere the coastlines remain unchanged, waiting without name. Somewhere the stars still align as they were once measured, And the map, unseen and unshared, continues to do its work. When an object disappears completely, it leaves behind a different kind of evidence. Not proof but tension, not certainty but shape. The unmarked map becomes such a presence, defined less by what is seen than by what is carefully avoided. Later historians will search archives for it and find only gaps arranged too neatly to be accidental. In the decades after the fall of the temple, cartography changes subtly. New maps emerge that seem overly cautious about the Western Sea. They fill the unknown with monsters, with warnings, with imagined terrors. It is as though something simpler, something more grounded, has been deliberately pushed aside. Fear becomes a substitute for memory, yet certain anomalies persist. Coastlines appear prematurely accurate. Islands are placed where no explorer claims to have sailed. Distances feel rehearsed rather than discovered. When questioned, mapmakers cite older sources now lost. Authorities accept this explanation because it leads nowhere. Lost sources cannot testify. In monasteries that survived the purges, there are whispers of forbidden parchment sealed into walls, of maps hidden not to be used but to be prevented from use. A few abbots are said to have refused renovations for centuries, insisting certain stones must not be moved. When asked why, they respond with prayer and the question dissolves. The unmarked map functions not as instruction, but as restraint. It teaches where not to go, when not to speak, how to avoid awakening attention. Those who remember its outlines understand that discovery invites claiming, and claiming invites corruption. Silence, by contrast, allows preservation. This may explain why, when later explorers finally cross the Western Sea, they do so loudly. They announce themselves. They name everything they touch. They plant symbols as if afraid the land might vanish without them. Their maps overflow with authority. Yet beneath this noise, something feels rehearsed, as if the path were already worn smooth by earlier passage. The Templar map, if it still exists in any form, does not compete with these later charts. It does not contradict them. It simply remains separate, a parallel memory running beneath the official record. It has no need to argue. It has already done what was required. There is a final tradition, difficult to trace but persistent across regions. It speaks of a map that could only be read when unfolded in a certain order, under a certain sky. If opened incorrectly, it revealed nothing but meaningless lines. If opened properly, it aligned land with stars, distance with time. Such a map would be useless to the impatient, dangerous only to the initiated. Whether this tradition preserves truth or metaphor is unclear. Perhaps the map was never meant to survive materially at all. Perhaps its true function was to train the mind, to teach how to see without claiming, how to know without announcing. In that sense, its disappearance is its success. The New World, before it bore a name, may have been protected not by walls or armies but by discretion, by those who chose not to tell. The map served as their quiet agreement with the land. We will remember you, but we will not summon others to you. And so the narrative closes not with revelation but with concealment perfected. The unmarked map does not ask to be found. It asks to be respected. Its silence is not emptiness, but intention sustained across centuries. Somewhere, perhaps folded into stone or memory, its lines still exist, not waiting to be rediscovered, but waiting to remain untouched. And that may be the most radical act of guardianship ever recorded, knowledge withheld so thoroughly that history itself learns to look away. The map is gone, the path remains, and the silence holds. History is often preserved by names. Kings endure because they are recorded. Battles survive because they are dated. But there exists another lineage of memory, one that refuses inscription. It lives instead in gesture, in custom, in the quiet insistence of stories told without attribution. These are the witnesses without names. Along the western edges of Europe, far from courts and scriptoria, such witnesses persist. Fishermen speak of them when the sea is calm and the night long, not as legend meant to entertain, but as recollection passed with care. They tell of men who arrived without banners, whose ships bore no sigils worth remembering. Men who dressed not as merchants nor as conquerors but as monks accustomed to discipline. They came ashore briefly. They spoke little, and then they left. These accounts are never written. Writing fixes memory, and fixed memory attracts inquiry. Instead, the stories travel by breath, father to son, master to apprentice, always accompanied by an unspoken instruction: do not embellish. Say only what must be said. In Ireland, along cliffs worn smooth by centuries of wind, there are carvings that trouble historians, crosses etched in a style older than expected. Not Celtic, not Roman, simple, restrained, deliberate. They face the western sea, not inland toward villages. No church claims them. No chronicle explains them. They remain, weathered yet stubborn, as if left by those who did not intend to return. Further south, in the coastal villages of Portugal, certain families preserve customs that feel out of place. Blessings spoken before voyages that invoke neither saint nor king. Old phrases that mention the farther shore without direction. When asked, elders smile politely and change the subject. Some knowledge is not theirs to explain. Across the ocean, beyond the reach of medieval Europe, other witnesses wait. Among certain coastal peoples, oral traditions speak of visitors who came before remembered contact. Pale men, robed, who arrived without aggression. They did not claim land. They did not build. They asked questions about rivers, about stones, about the sky. They traded small objects of metal for stories, then departed. These accounts do not celebrate the visitors. They simply acknowledge them. What binds these witnesses is not detail but behavior. The men they describe do not act like explorers. They do not act like settlers. They behave like observers or perhaps custodians. Their presence is purposeful but restrained. They leave markers but no structures, memory but no dominance. Such testimony unsettles because it resists classification. It does not fit neatly into academic categories. It lacks dates. It offers no names to cross-reference. And yet it persists across distance and culture with a consistency that feels intentional. The Church, when it encounters hints of these stories, does not refute them. It simply does not pursue them. Parish records remain silent. Monastic chronicles glance past them. Silence becomes policy without ever being declared. The witnesses themselves sense this boundary. They speak cautiously, often only when prompted by familiarity or trust. To outsiders, their words feel incomplete. To those within the tradition, they are sufficient. What they preserve is not a claim that must be proven, but a memory that must be carried. The absence of names protects both speaker and subject. Without names, there can be no accusation. Without dates, no contradiction. The story remains mobile, adapting just enough to survive. As this chapter opens, we are invited into this quieter archive. One not stored in vaults but in people. One not written to endure but spoken to pass unnoticed. These witnesses do not demand belief. They merely continue. And in their continuation a pattern emerges, of arrival without announcement, of presence without possession, of departure without trace. A pattern that aligns too closely with the known temperament of the temple to be ignored, yet too softly to be seized. The witnesses remain unnamed. But they are not alone. What the witnesses remember is not an event, but a manner of being. This is why their accounts endure while details dissolve. They recall how the visitors listened more than they spoke. How they observed the land as one might observe a sleeping child, carefully, reverently, without desire to wake it. Such behavior leaves an impression deeper than dates ever could. In the far western Isles, shepherds once spoke of robed men who walked inland without escort. They paused at ancient stones long older than the crosses nearby. They touched the markings with familiarity, not curiosity, as though confirming something already known. Then they turned back toward the sea. No questions were asked of them and none were answered. The encounter lingered only as a quiet certainty. Something had been checked and found still intact. These stories survive because they ask for nothing. They do not insist on recognition. They do not attempt to rewrite history. They exist alongside it, parallel and patient. Scholars searching for disruption overlook them precisely because they do not disrupt. They settle instead into the margins of collective memory. Among coastal communities, certain navigational taboos emerge that are never fully explained. Routes avoided despite favorable winds. Shallows approached with reverence rather than caution. Elders instruct the young not to linger near particular inlets, offering no reason beyond tradition. When pressed, they say only that others passed there once. Across the ocean, the pattern repeats in altered form. Indigenous storytellers speak of men who arrived already knowing which paths led inland and which did not. They did not wander aimlessly. They moved as though guided by knowledge acquired elsewhere. This confounds later assumptions of accidental discovery. Accidents leave chaos. These arrivals leave order, however fleeting. What is most striking is what the witnesses do not report. There are no tales of violence, no mention of conversion or command. The visitors do not seek to change what they encounter. They seem concerned only with verification, as though tasked with ensuring that something remains as it should be. This posture aligns with the deeper ethos of the temple. The order was not founded to expand territory but to protect passage, to guard thresholds, to stand watch where movement between worlds, sacred and profane, known and unknown, required discipline. Seen through this lens, the behavior described by the witnesses becomes coherent. The Church, ever attentive to doctrinal deviation, would have reacted strongly to stories of unapproved evangelism or heretical rites. That it did not suggest such actions never occurred. The visitors did not preach. They did not challenge authority. They remained beneath notice by design. Witnesses without names offer another protection as well. They prevent singular ownership of the story. No one can claim authority over memory when memory belongs to many, each holding a fragment. This dispersal mirrors the temple's own methods. Knowledge divided is knowledge defended. There are moments when the witnesses almost surface into official record. A marginal note in a travelogue mentioning earlier visitors. A puzzled reference in a colonial letter to stones already marked. These moments pass quickly, absorbed by the larger narrative of discovery and conquest. History prefers clear beginnings. It has little patience for quiet continuities. Yet the witnesses remain. They adapt. They soften their language. They allow their stories to become tradition rather than testimony. In doing so, they survive. What they preserve is not proof but posture, a way of moving through the world that leaves it largely unchanged. This may be why their memory aligns so closely with the idea of guardianship rather than exploration. Guardians do not announce themselves. They confirm, then withdraw. As the pressure of later centuries presses down, these stories retreat further into obscurity. They are told less often, or told only at certain times, or told as metaphor rather than memory. But they are not erased. They are simply lowered like voices in a place where echoes travel too far, and so the witnesses continue their quiet work. They keep alive the sense that the world has been visited before its official unveiling, that knowledge once moved across oceans without leaving banners behind. That presence does not always seek permanence. The absence of names remains their shield. And within that absence, memory stays free. There comes a moment in every hidden history when silence itself becomes a witness, not through speech but through consistency. Across centuries and continents, the restraint shown by these unnamed observers never wavers. This constancy is what gives their memory weight. It is not what they say that endures, but what they refuse to claim. As generations pass, the witnesses adapt to survive. What was once spoken plainly becomes wrapped in proverb. What was once remembered as encounter becomes remembered as warning. Stories shorten, details blur, yet the core remains intact like a stone worn smooth by water but never carried away. In some villages, the memory takes the form of ritual, a yearly pause before sailing west, a candle lit at dusk facing the open sea, then extinguished without prayer. No one remembers when it began. No one remembers why it must continue, but it does. Habit becomes inheritance. In others, the memory hides in language. Certain words are reserved for the western horizon, words not used elsewhere. They imply distance without direction, arrival without return. These linguistic fragments resist translation. When written down, they lose their meaning. Spoken, they remain intact. Across the ocean, the echoes shift again. Here, the witnesses do not speak of return voyages. They speak instead of waiting, of a presence that came, confirmed, and withdrew. The land, they say, was left unchanged on purpose. The visitors understood that to remain would invite imbalance, that some knowledge must touch lightly or not at all. This understanding sets them apart from all who came later. Colonizers announce themselves. Explorers rename what already has names. Empires measure worth by extraction. The unnamed visitors do none of this. They measure by continuity, by what survives untouched. It is tempting to imagine these witnesses as passive, as mere observers of history's march. But their role is more active than it appears. By refusing to name, to date, to exalt, they deny later powers the tools of appropriation. You cannot conquer what you cannot define. You cannot rewrite what was never formally written. The Church, in its quiet way, seems to recognize this boundary. While it claims authority over doctrine, it leaves geography to crowns. And when geography itself resists claim, the Church steps back. Silence becomes mutual, an unspoken agreement that some matters are best left unexamined. Over time, the witnesses fade further from view. Their stories become seasonal, told only under certain stars, or personal, shared only within families. Outsiders hear fragments and dismiss them as folklore. The dismissal protects the truth better than belief ever could. What remains is a sensation rather than a narrative. A sense that the Western lands were never truly empty, that before the age of banners and proclamations, there were visitors who arrived already knowing when to leave. That history did not begin at discovery, but paused, waiting for permission to speak again. And perhaps that permission was never granted. The unnamed witnesses do not mourn this. They understand that not all truths seek daylight. Some endure precisely because they remain in shadow. Their role is not to convince, but to remember quietly enough that memory does not attract destruction. As the centuries turn, the witnesses thin, but they do not vanish. Their presence lingers in the spaces between official records, in the uneasy feeling that something has been omitted, in the way certain questions are never fully asked. They stand at the edge of history, not opposing it, but watching as one watches a tide, knowing when it will rise, knowing when it will recede, and trusting that the shore will remain. And so this chapter closes not with testimony, but with restraint renewed. The witnesses without names have done their work. They have carried memory far enough that it no longer needs protection through speech. What they saw remains unclaimed. What they knew remains undated. And what they preserved waits still, beyond the reach of certainty. Now the history tightens, drawing inward like a held breath. What was once suggestion becomes sequence. What was once silence gains weight. The year is fixed. The date recorded, October in the year 1307. On that morning, the Order of the Temple is named enemy, not gradually, not cautiously, but all at once, as though the accusation itself had been waiting for the signal to descend. Arrests are sudden, doors opened before dawn, brothers taken from prayer, from sleep. From routine so ordinary it feels rehearsed. The accusations are not discovered, they are delivered, repeated word for word across regions as if memorized in advance. Confessions follow, shaped not by truth but by pressure. Fire does what questioning cannot. The world watches the spectacle and believes the story is complete, yet something is missing. At La Rochelle, the great western port of the Templars, the king's men arrive to seize ships and treasure. They find stone keys, empty water. Records that end too early. The fleet, once counted among the order's greatest strengths, is gone. Not burned, not seized, not delayed, gone. This absence anchors the entire chronicle. It is not rumor, it is not interpretation. It is acknowledged even by those who wish it forgot. Royal documents note the lack indirectly by omission. Ecclesiastical inquiries never ask where the ships have gone. The silence is immediate, coordinated, and revealing. This is the fracture where secrecy becomes necessity. If the Templars were guilty only of heresy, flight would make no sense. If they sought escape alone, they would scatter, dissolve, hide inland among allies, but they do not. The direction of their disappearance matters more than the fact of it. Where would they go? The East offers no refuge. Every road leads deeper into church authority. The North offers no protection. Kingdoms there are aligned, watchful, eager to demonstrate loyalty. The South burns with conflict and surveillance. Only the West remains vast, unclaimed, and ungoverned by immediate power, and crucially already known. The Templars do not flee blindly. Blind flight leaves evidence, panic leaves debris. This departure leaves nothing. Ships vanish before warrants arrive. Routes are chosen that avoid witnesses. Supplies suggest not haste but endurance. Prepared flight is not escape, it is relocation. What follows is not pursuit but erasure. The crown turns its gaze toward trials and confiscations. Fires rise. Gold changes hands. Attention is fixed where noise exists. Meanwhile, the missing fleet is allowed to become a footnote without footnotes. No effort is made to recover it. No bounty is offered. No search recorded. The disappearance becomes procedural, as if disappearance itself were the intended conclusion. But disappearances rarely end stories. They move them. The ships do not vanish into legend. They vanish into memory, into the same westward silence that had already been prepared. Whatever obligation the temple carried, whatever knowledge demanded movement, now finds its moment. The sea opens again, not as unknown terror but as remembered passage. A route once taken, now taken again under greater necessity. The order falls on land but remains intact in motion. As the fires burn and confessions echo, the most important act of the temple occurs unseen. The fleet moves beyond jurisdiction, beyond accusation, beyond history's immediate reach. And Europe, focused on spectacle, does not notice what has slipped its grasp. The anchor has dropped. The current has shifted. What remains to be seen lies not in the records of the condemned, but in the wake of what was allowed to leave. Once the fleet is gone, the world behaves as though it had never existed. This is not ignorance. It is adjustment. Power learns quickly where to look and where not to. The absence of pursuit is as deliberate as the disappearance itself. Kings do not chase what they prefer to forget. Royal records from the years that follow grow strangely narrow. They linger on interrogations, on property seized, on debts recalculated. Pages are filled with inventories of silver and land, but the sea is scarcely mentioned. It is as though the western horizon has been folded shut. What cannot be reclaimed is not discussed. The Church follows a similar pattern. Councils convene to condemn doctrine, not direction. Sermons warn against secret rites, not secret voyages. Fires are lit to cleanse belief, not to illuminate paths of escape. The missing ships remain untheologized and therefore untouched. This narrowing of focus is not accidental. Authority survives by defining the battlefield, by choosing where truth may be contested. The West, wide and unbounded, offers no such containment. To pursue the fleet would be to admit uncertainty, and uncertainty weakens command. Meanwhile, those who have departed understand this instinctively. They do not expect pursuit, they expect forgetting. Their route is chosen not only for distance but for plausibility. The sea swallows many things. It requires no explanation when they do not return. What matters is timing. The departure occurs just before the order to arrest is fully enacted, close enough to appear coincidental, distant enough to avoid interception. This precision suggests foreknowledge. Warnings carried quietly. Signals exchanged long before the public decree. The temple does not react, it responds. Within the fleet there is no celebration of escape. Escape implies survival for its own sake. What unfolds instead is duty fulfilled under pressure. The brothers understand that the fall of the order on land is inevitable. They do not attempt to prevent it. They accept it as part of a larger movement, one that requires sacrifice. This acceptance is unsettling. It implies that what is being preserved elsewhere outweighs the survival of the institution itself, that the order is willing to dissolve publicly so that something else may endure privately. Institutions rarely choose this. Guardians do. The route westward is not chosen because it is empty. It is chosen because it is quiet, quiet enough to receive what cannot be defended by armies or doctrine. Whatever the fleet carries, whether knowledge, symbols, or memory, it requires space beyond interference. The disappearance also protects those left behind. With the ships gone, interrogators have fewer questions to ask. The focus remains on ritual accusations, not logistical ones. The missing fleet becomes an inconvenience, then a curiosity, then a non-event. Within a generation, it is no longer mentioned at all. Yet absence has a way of shaping narrative even when unacknowledged. Later chroniclers will note the sudden completeness of the Order's destruction and feel something unresolved. How could such an extensive network collapse without resistance, without pursuit, without trace? The question lingers unanswered and therefore potent. Some will speculate, most will not. Speculation requires space, and the medieval world offers little of it. Life moves on. New orders rise, old ones burn. The sea continues its rhythms, indifferent to the stories it conceals. For those who departed, the westward passage becomes the final act of obedience. They are no longer visible representatives of the temple. They are no longer subjects of Christendom's judgment. They become something older and quieter, carriers of trust. The West does not promise safety. It promises obscurity. And obscurity in moments like this is the highest form of protection. Whatever awaits them across the water is not refuge but responsibility. They do not know how long they will remain. They know only that they must arrive. As the fleet moves beyond familiar routes, Europe contracts behind it. The known world shrinks. Authority fades with distance. The brothers feel the strange calm that comes when consequence has already been accepted. Fear loosens its grip, purpose sharpens. The order of the temple, condemned and broken in record, continues in motion, not as an army, not as a church, but as a memory in transit carried across water that answers to no crown. The erasure is nearly complete, the relocation underway. And history, focused elsewhere, does not turn its head. When a power falls publicly, it often leaves behind noise, rebellion, lamentation, resistance. But when the order of the temple collapses, it does so with an unnerving quiet. This quiet is not resignation. It is completion. What needed to be moved has already moved. What needed to be hidden has already passed beyond reach. On land, the fires burn lower. Trials repeat themselves until their words lose force. Confessions blur together. The spectacle exhausts its audience. Attention shifts, as it always does, toward new conflicts, new anxieties. The destruction of the temple becomes history faster than expected, as if the world itself were eager to move on. At sea, time behaves differently. Days stretch. The horizon becomes constant. The brothers aboard the fleet no longer count hours by bells, but by changes in light and wind. Each sunrise feels less tethered to the world they left behind. Authority fades not with rebellion, but with distance. The farther they move, the less real the accusations feel, not because they are false, but because they no longer matter. They do not speak of the trials. They do not mourn the order. Mourning would suggest loss. This is not loss. It is transformation. What was visible has been surrendered so that what is essential may persist. The westward passage confirms what they already know, that the sea is not a barrier but a veil. Those who control land believe it separates. Those who cross it understand that it conceals. The temple has always understood concealment. Now it practices it at scale. No pursuit follows, not because the fleet is fast, but because no one is looking. The king has his confiscations. The church has its confession. Both are satisfied. To ask what escaped would be to admit incompleteness. And incompleteness undermines authority. This mutual convenience seals the silence. Somewhere behind them, the name of the temple begins to harden into legend. Accusations replace nuance. Symbols lose context. The public memory simplifies. This too is protection. A misunderstood past is easier to guard than a remembered one. Ahead of them, the sea begins to change. The water carries a different color. The air thickens with unfamiliar scent. Birds appear where none should be. These signs are noted but not celebrated. Celebration invites attachment. Attachment invites permanence. They are not here to remain. The historical anchor of this flight is not the date of arrest, nor the fall of the order. It is the moment when the fleet passes beyond the last known reference point and continues without hesitation. This is where history, as recorded, ends. Everything beyond becomes inference, memory, and guarded tradition. What happens next will not be written by victors. It will not be archived. It will survive only in fragments, objects without provenance, stories without names, maps without legends. The temple understands this outcome. It has prepared for it. By allowing itself to be destroyed in full view, it diverts attention from what escapes unseen. This is not failure. It is misdirection perfected. As the ships advance into waters that will later be claimed as discovery, they do so without intention to announce themselves. Their arrival will leave no proclamation. Their departure will leave no trail. Whatever they confirm, whatever they safeguard, will be folded back into silence. The sea receives them without comment. The horizon does not resist. The world does not record the crossing. And so the most consequential movement of the temple passes unnoticed, unchallenged, and unremembered by those who believe history belongs only to the loud. This chapter closes not with resolution, but with displacement. The center of the story has shifted irreversibly westward. The anchor has been lifted from Europe and cast into deeper water where records cannot reach. What the fleet carries will soon touch land again, not as conquest, not as escape, but as continuation. And when it does, the world will not yet have words for what has arrived. If the Templars reached the western lands, they did so without ceremony. No horns announced their arrival. No banners cut the air. The shore received them as it receives all things, without acknowledgement, without resistance. This was not an entrance meant to be remembered. It was a passage meant to leave no echo. They did not plant crosses. To plant is to claim, and claiming binds a place to power. They spoke no proclamations, for words once spoken cannot be recalled. They imposed no names, understanding that naming fixes a thing into the dominion of the speaker. Instead, they allowed the land to remain as it was, unnamed, unmeasured, and therefore free. The presence of the temple reveals itself only indirectly, like breath on cold stone that vanishes as soon as it is noticed. Inland from the coast, markers appear that do not belong to the peoples who lived there, yet do not disrupt them. Stones arranged with deliberate symmetry, lines aligned not to dwellings but to the rising and setting of stars. These markers do not dominate the landscape. They converse with it. Agricultural patterns offer another quiet clue. In certain regions, centuries later, the soil bears signs of methods not native to the place, yet not sustained long enough to alter tradition. Fields briefly cultivated, then returned to rest. Crops introduced experimentally, then abandoned. It is as though someone tested the land's capacity, then withdrew without insistence. Metalwork tells a similar story. Objects unearthed far from expected trade routes. Alloys unfamiliar to local craft, yet not plentiful enough to suggest settlement. A blade here, a clasp there. Functional, restrained, undecorated. Tools rather than treasures. When discovered, they confuse historians because they do not belong to a sequence. They arrive without origin and depart without continuation. This is presence without occupation. It is the mark of those who pass through with intention but without desire to remain. The atmosphere surrounding these traces is hushed, almost reverent. Nothing suggests urgency. Nothing suggests ambition. There is no attempt to reshape the land in the image of elsewhere. They did not stay. Staying invites attachment, and attachment invites ownership. They did not conquer. Conquest demands justification. They observed, recorded, and withdrew, leaving behind only what could survive unnoticed. The land was not altered. It was acknowledged. Why would such restraint be chosen? Because discovery was not the purpose. Discovery invites witnesses. It invites competition. Guardianship, by contrast, requires anonymity. A guardian does not announce what is being guarded. To do so would defeat the task. Something here mattered enough to protect, yet too dangerous to expose. Not gold, which invites greed. Not territory, which invites war. But perhaps knowledge bound to place. Or alignment between land and sky. Or a memory older than any authority that would seek to exploit it. The Templars understood that some things must remain unnamed to remain safe. A named place becomes a destination. An unnamed place remains a threshold. They chose the threshold. As they withdrew, they left no signs meant for recognition, only confirmations meant for those who already knew how to look. The land remained as it had been, bearing no new titles, owing allegiance to no distant crown. As this chapter opens, we stand before a shoreline that remembers without speaking. A place touched lightly, then left intact. The absence of claim is not neglect. It is protection practiced to perfection. And somewhere beneath soil and stone, the land holds what it was asked to keep, waiting, unnamed and undisturbed. Those who arrived without claim learned first to listen. Before any step inland, before any marking of stone or soil, there was stillness. The brothers paused at the edge of the unfamiliar world and allowed it to speak in its own rhythm. Wind through unfamiliar trees. Water moving in patterns not yet named. The calls of creatures whose meanings were not yet assigned. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was taken for granted. They moved inland sparingly, never in numbers large enough to draw attention. Paths were chosen that followed natural contours rather than forcing new ones. Where the land rose, they rose with it. Where it fell away, they withdrew. This was not hesitation. It was recognition. The land was not empty. It was occupied by its own order, one that did not require domination to be understood. Stone markers were placed only after observation, never at the highest point, never at the most visible. They were set where lines of sight converged naturally, where sky and earth already conversed. The markers did not interrupt. They aligned. Their purpose was not to signal arrival, but to confirm correspondence between place and memory, between what was known and what was found. These stones carried no language, no symbols of Europe, no emblems of the temple. Their meaning lay in position, not inscription. To anyone unaware, they were simply part of the land. To those trained to read space rather than text, they formed a quiet sentence spoken only once. The brothers worked with restraint. They recorded measurements not to exploit but to understand. Distances between rivers, angles of shadow at solstice, the way certain plants responded to altered soil. Each observation was noted mentally, then released. Writing was avoided. Writing invites permanence, and permanence invites attention. When interaction with local peoples occurred, it was brief and deliberate, exchange rather than instruction. Objects traded were small and functional, never ornamental. Iron for knowledge, copper for guidance. The brothers asked about seasons, about floods, about places avoided without explanation. They listened carefully to answers, for avoidance often guards what words cannot. There was no attempt to integrate. Integration creates trace. Instead, they remained adjacent, present enough to learn, distant enough to leave no imprint. Even their shelters were temporary, built to be reclaimed by weather. Nothing was constructed that could not be unmade by time. This approach confounds later expectations. History is accustomed to impact. It looks for ruins, for transformation, for scars. Here, it finds none. The absence itself becomes the signature. Presence measured by how little it alters. The decision not to stay is not rooted in fear. It is rooted in understanding. To remain would be to invite succession. Succession invites record. Record invites claim. The temple understands this chain too well to allow it to begin. Guardianship requires departure. The protected thing must not become dependent on the guardian's presence. It must remain as it was, capable of enduring without supervision. The brothers do not ask whether others will come later. That question lies beyond their mandate. Their task is only to ensure that what exists now survives this moment intact. Before leaving, they return to the markers one final time. Adjustments are made, small, precise. A stone turned slightly. A placement corrected by inches. These gestures feel ceremonial, but they are practical. Alignment must be exact. Memory must be accurate. Then they withdraw, retracing their path with the same care they used to arrive. Footprints are erased where possible, camps dismantled, traces minimized. Even the act of leaving is conducted as quietly as arrival. The land is allowed to close behind them. From the sea, the coast appears unchanged. No signs betray what has occurred inland. The horizon offers nothing new. This is intentional. The most effective protection is invisibility. As the ships pull away, there is no sense of abandonment. Only completion. Whatever needed to be seen has been seen. Whatever needed to be confirmed has been confirmed. The land remains unnamed and therefore unclaimed. The brothers do not look back for long. To look back is to linger. They face forward toward obligation not yet fulfilled elsewhere. Behind them, the shore resumes its silence, holding what it has been entrusted to keep. Long after the ships have withdrawn, the land resumes its ordinary rhythms. Wind moves through trees without disturbance. Rivers continue their courses, unbothered by having been measured. The stones remain where they were placed, indistinguishable from those shaped only by weather and time. To any observer without instruction, nothing has occurred. This is the success of landfall without claim. The traces left behind do not announce themselves. They do not demand interpretation. They wait instead for alignment, of knowledge, of posture, of silence. Centuries may pass before anyone notices them at all. And when they are noticed, they are rarely understood. Later peoples encounter these markers and fold them into their own worlds. A stone becomes part of a boundary. Another becomes a resting place. Some are moved slightly, their purpose altered without being erased. This does not destroy the original intent. It merely deepens its concealment. A thing repurposed is less likely to be questioned. Agricultural anomalies fade back into the soil. Experimental clearings return to forest. Introduced plants fail or adapt quietly, leaving no disruption significant enough to record. The land absorbs the brief touch and releases it. Presence dissolves into continuity. The metalwork buried or forgotten waits longest. When it resurfaces centuries later, it does so without explanation. Found out of time, out of context, it resists classification. Scholars argue over trade routes that never existed. Others dismiss the objects as contamination of layers, errors of excavation. The debate circles without resolution. The truth remains unspoken because it cannot be easily spoken. What the Templars practiced here was not secrecy born of fear, but of discipline. They understood that the most dangerous thing one can do to a place of significance is to announce it. Announcement invites hierarchy. Hierarchy invites exploitation. Exploitation invites ruin. By refusing to claim, they denied the future a trigger. This restraint suggests that the land itself held meaning beyond material value, something about its alignment, its position beneath certain stars. Its relationship to older cycles not bound to European reckoning. Perhaps it was a place named in fragments of older texts, or a location marked in symbolic geography rather than physical description, or simply a node, a convergence where patterns long studied found confirmation. Whatever the reason, the decision was unanimous. This place must remain untouched by authority. The temple did not imagine itself eternal. It understood that institutions rise and fall. What it sought to protect was not itself, but continuity, the ability for something to persist beyond the lifespan of any order, any crown, any creed. In this, landfall without claim becomes an act of humility rarely seen in history. To arrive and refuse ownership, to know and refuse proclamation, to see and refuse to speak. These refusals are not weakness. They are strength refined. The land remains unnamed not because no one thought to name it, but because naming was consciously withheld. Names are tools. They shape perception. They invite maps, borders, narratives. By denying a name, the Templars denied the future a handle by which to pull the place into history prematurely. This unnamed state does not mean forgotten. It means protected by anonymity. Over time, the memory of the landfall fades even among those who carried it. That too is intended. Memory that lasts forever becomes burden. Memory allowed to thin becomes legend. Legend allowed to blur becomes instinct. Instinct guides without explaining itself. Somewhere within the temple's surviving lineages, whether formal or dissolved, this instinct remains. A sense that certain places must not be spoken of directly, that some truths lose their power when dragged into light. That guardianship sometimes means stepping away and trusting the land to keep its own counsel. As this chapter closes, we are left not with evidence but with posture. A way of encountering the world that resists conquest by refusing participation in it. The land remains as it was before arrival, and yet subtly changed, not in form but in having been recognized. The ships are gone. The markers are silent. The soil keeps its counsel. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the consequences of this restraint continue to unfold, quietly, patiently, waiting for a future moment when guardianship will be tested again. Guardians rarely announce themselves. To do so would be to misunderstand their role. A guardian does not seek recognition, nor does he declare what he protects. His authority comes not from visibility, but from patience. If the Templars found something in the Western lands, their silence afterward suggests a role not of possession, but of custody. Custody implies restraint. It implies that what is guarded does not belong to the guardian but has been entrusted to him for a time. This distinction matters. Possession demands control. Custody demands discipline. The temple had been trained for centuries in the difference. The signs attributed to their presence are never monumental. There are no walls rising from the earth, no towers announcing vigilance. Instead, there are small, deliberate marks that reveal themselves only when sought from the correct angle. A cross etched deep inside a cave, placed where light reaches only briefly each day. A compass rose hidden within stonework, visible only when shadow aligns just so. These are not symbols meant to impress. They are confirmations meant to reassure. Each mark is an answer to a question asked elsewhere, a signal returned, not broadcast. The restraint shown in these symbols is striking. They are consistent with a mindset that expects no visitors, only successors. Those who understand the language will recognize them. Those who do not will pass them by without suspicion. This is guardianship refined to near invisibility. What then is being guarded? It is not gold. Gold demands protection through force. It invites theft, conquest, and conflict. The temple had already seen how gold distorts purpose. If gold were the object, fortresses would have risen, armies would have been stationed. None of this occurs. The guardianship here concerns knowledge. Knowledge bound to place rather than text. Knowledge that cannot be moved without losing its meaning. Perhaps a site whose position aligns with older patterns of the earth and sky. Perhaps a convergence where memory, geography, and symbol overlap. Perhaps a lineage, not of blood, but of responsibility, rooted in land rather than family. There is also the possibility of a truth too destabilizing for authority. Crowns depend on hierarchy. Churches depend on interpretation. A truth that bypasses both, grounded instead in natural order or ancient covenant, would threaten every system built upon mediation. Such a truth would require protection not through secrecy alone, but through obscurity. The Templars understood this danger intimately. Their history had taught them that revelation invites corruption, that what is named will be claimed, that what is claimed will be fought over. Survival, then, requires remaining unclaimed. This is why the guardianship leaves so little trace. Each sign is minimal, sufficient only for recognition. There is no redundancy, no excess. Excess attracts attention. Attention invites interpretation. Interpretation invites distortion. The guardians do not remain present. Presence creates dependency. Instead, they withdraw after confirming that what must endure remains intact. Their absence is part of their function. A guardian who never leaves becomes ruler. A guardian who departs preserves balance. Over time, these guardianship marks fade into landscape. Erosion softens edges. Lichen obscures lines. The marks become indistinguishable from chance unless one knows where and how to look. This fading is not failure, it is maturation. The best guardianship leaves nothing that must be defended. Yet there is a lingering sense, subtle but persistent, that someone once stood watch here, not actively, not constantly, but attentively. Like a sentinel who checks a gate, ensures it is still closed, and then walks away without waiting for thanks. As this chapter opens, we begin to feel that presence, not as movement but as stillness charged with intention. The sense of watchers who are not vigilant in the common sense but patient beyond measure. They are not guarding against intrusion. They are guarding against premature revelation. The land does not feel abandoned. It feels overseen. And that distinction changes everything. Quiet guardianship depends upon continuity rather than control. It assumes that what is being protected will outlast the protector, and that the task is not to remain forever but to ensure endurance. This philosophy runs counter to empire, which builds to be seen, and counter to conquest, which measures success by permanence. The Templars, shaped by centuries of vigilance at sacred thresholds, understood another measure entirely. The marks they left were never instructions. They were acknowledgments. A cross carved deep within stone was not a declaration of faith imposed upon a place, but a signal that faith had already recognized it. A compass rose hidden in rock did not point outward, but inward toward orientation rather than destination. These symbols did not guide strangers. They reassured those who already knew. Such guardianship requires a shared language that does not rely on words. It relies on posture, on recognition felt rather than reasoned. The temple cultivated this language through discipline, through silence practiced until it became instinct, through obedience to patterns older than doctrine. If the guardianship concerned a place, then that place was not sacred because of what occurred there, but because of how it aligned. Certain locations hold resonance not because of history, but because of position. They exist at intersections, of sky paths, of water flows, of unseen geometries that ancient builders understood intuitively. To disturb such places is to disrupt more than stone and soil. If it concerned a lineage, then it was not a lineage of blood but of obligation. Those entrusted with knowledge would pass it not through inheritance but through recognition. A successor would not be chosen by name but by readiness, by the ability to keep what must be kept without asking why. If it concerned a truth, then that truth was likely simple and therefore dangerous. Simple truths bypass authority. They do not require interpretation. They do not demand mediation. A truth that can be known directly undermines every system built to control access to meaning. Such truths cannot be destroyed, only delayed. The temple had learned through painful experience that delay is sometimes the highest form of protection. This is why their guardianship appears so restrained. They do not attempt to freeze time or seal knowledge away permanently. They allow it to breathe within limits, to remain present enough to endure, distant enough to avoid capture. The guardians are not jailers. They are stewards of interval. Over generations, this stewardship becomes almost invisible. The successors, if they exist at all, may not even know what they guard in explicit terms. They may only know how to behave around certain places, how to avoid interference, how to recognize when something has been disturbed. This is guardianship without ownership. Later traditions mistake this absence for neglect. They assume that what is not defended must not matter. But this assumption reveals a misunderstanding. True guardianship does not draw lines and stand upon them. It moves along the boundary, checking for imbalance, correcting gently, then withdrawing again. There are moments, rare, fleeting, when something goes wrong. A marker is damaged. A site is approached too closely. In such cases, correction occurs quietly. a stone repositioned, a path redirected, a rumor introduced to discourage curiosity. These interventions are subtle enough to appear accidental. The guardians do not act often. Acting too frequently draws pattern. Pattern invites analysis. Analysis invites exposure. Waiting becomes their primary tool. This waiting is not passive, it is attentive, like a watch kept through listening rather than sight. The guardians learn to sense change through absence, when something that should be quiet becomes loud, when something that should be obscure becomes noticed. The presence felt at these sites is therefore not constant. It is conditional. It emerges only when balance is threatened. Then it recedes again, leaving no trace of intervention. As centuries pass, the original guardians fade into memory, then into myth, then into nothing at all. But the role remains, not because it is enforced, but because it is necessary. Certain things, once discovered, must be protected from discovery again. The Templars understood this paradox, that finding something obligates one to hide it, that guardianship is often an act of disappearance. As this part closes, the sense of watchers grows quieter still, not gone but settled, like eyes that close not in sleep but in trust. Trust that what was once confirmed remains undisturbed. Trust that silence will continue to do its work. They are not waiting for instruction. They are waiting for disturbance. The longest guardianship is the one that learns how to disappear entirely. When the guardian becomes indistinguishable from the landscape, protection no longer depends on presence. It depends on balance. This is the final refinement of custody, and it is here that the Templars' discipline reaches its quiet conclusion. Over time, even the knowledge of guardianship thins. Those who once understood the full weight of what was kept begin to remember only fragments. Instructions become customs. Customs become instincts. Instincts persist without explanation. This dilution is not decay. It is adaptation. Knowledge that remains too clear invites attention. Knowledge that becomes felt rather than articulated survives. The subtle symbols, crosses, compass roses, alignments continue to fade. Weather softens their edges. Growth obscures them. To an untrained eye, they are nothing. To a trained one, they are enough. Recognition does not require clarity, it requires familiarity. What remains most striking is the absence of conflict around these places. Empires rise and fall nearby. Borders shift. Wars pass through. Yet certain sites remain oddly untouched, avoided without conscious reason. Maps curve around them. Settlements skirt their edges. This avoidance is rarely deliberate. It is inherited hesitation. Such hesitation is powerful. It moves silently through generations, shaping behavior without demanding belief. No one remembers who first suggested caution. No one challenges it. To challenge it would require numbing it, and numbing it would strip it of its quiet authority. Guardians, if they exist at all now, do not intervene directly. Their work is largely complete. The thing entrusted has passed through its most vulnerable period, the moment of first contact, when discovery might have led to claim. Having survived that, it no longer requires constant watchfulness. It requires only continued obscurity. This is perhaps the most unsettling implication of all, that whatever the Templars encountered in the Western lands did not need to be defended forever. Only long enough to allow history to forget it was ever at risk. The idea of watchers waiting does not imply vigilance in the usual sense. It implies readiness, a readiness that may never be called upon. The guardians are not poised to act. They are poised to remain still. Movement would indicate failure. Stillness indicates success. When modern minds encounter this notion, they often search for drama. For secret orders still active, for rituals performed in shadow, for sentinels guarding forbidden truth. But such imagery misunderstands the nature of effective guardianship. The most successful guardian leaves no successor who knows they are one. The presence, then, is not active. It is latent, like a sealed door that requires no guard because no one remembers it exists, or a path that disappears simply because no one walks it anymore. As this chapter closes, the sense of watchers softens further. It becomes less a presence and more an atmosphere, a feeling that some places resist intrusion without force, that some truths endure not because they are defended but because they are allowed to rest. The Templars did not imagine themselves as final arbiters. They acted as transitional figures, bridges between knowledge discovered and knowledge withheld. Once the crossing was complete, the bridge could collapse without consequence. What remains is the land unchanged and unnamed, the silence intact, and a guardianship so complete it no longer needs guardians. The watchers are not active, they are not visible, they are not even certain. They are waiting only in the sense that balance always waits, not for time to pass, but for time to leave it alone. Institutions rarely answer questions that threaten their foundations. They learn instead to redirect attention, to narrow focus, to let certain possibilities pass without comment until they dissolve on their own. This is how silence becomes policy without ever being announced. The Church does not refute the idea of westward Templar knowledge. Refutation would require engagement. Engagement would require acknowledgement. Instead, it chooses omission. Sermons speak of heresy and obedience. Councils debate doctrine and discipline. The sea remains absent from their concern as though distance itself were irrelevant to faith. This absence is not accidental. The Church understands the danger of precedent. To admit that sacred knowledge traveled beyond its jurisdiction, unblessed and unrecorded, would fracture the architecture of authority. It would suggest that truth can move without mediation, that guardianship can exist without sanction. Such a suggestion is intolerable. Royal archives behave similarly, though for different reasons. Kings depend upon origin stories. Discovery legitimizes claim. The moment of first arrival becomes the cornerstone of possession. To acknowledge that others arrived earlier, without crown, without charter, would unravel this logic. It would raise questions of prior right that cannot be answered without diminishing power. So the archives fall quiet. There is no debate over missing fleets, no inquiry into unexplained knowledge. The conversation simply ends. Documents that might invite speculation are left uncopied. Marginal notes are excluded from later compilations. Silence is enforced not by decree but by repetition of absence. Maps tell this story most clearly. Early charts of the Atlantic brim with uncertainty. Monsters, storms, and warnings crowd the margins. These images are not merely imaginative. They function as deterrents. Fear becomes a substitute for forgotten memory. Where something was once known quietly, it is now declared unknowable. Later, after official discovery has been proclaimed, maps are redrawn with confidence. Coastlines appear clean, authoritative. Names are assigned retroactively. Earlier hints of prior knowledge are overwritten, not challenged. The narrative is simplified to protect legitimacy. This systematic silence extends beyond parchment. Scholars learn quickly which questions lead nowhere. Patrons reward work that reinforces accepted timelines. Curiosity is shaped by survival. Over generations, even the impulse to ask fades. What is remarkable is how coordinated this forgetting becomes without explicit coordination. Church and crown do not conspire openly. They simply share an interest. Stability requires coherence. Coherence requires a clean beginning. Anything that complicates that beginning is quietly set aside. Yet silence does not erase. It preserves differently. By refusing to refute, institutions avoid drawing attention. By refusing to record, they allow ambiguity to harden into assumption. Over time, the absence of evidence becomes evidence of absence, and the truth, unspoken, slips beneath the threshold of inquiry. This is not denial born of ignorance. It is preservation through restraint. A tacit understanding that some histories, if examined too closely, would destabilize the present more than they would illuminate the past. As this chapter opens, we begin to sense the weight of that restraint, not as oppression but as careful containment. The institutions do not fear the truth itself, they fear its consequences, and so the silence holds, Not brittle, not anxious, but deliberate. Institutional silence matures with time. What begins as omission becomes tradition. What begins as caution becomes doctrine. Eventually, no one remembers that there was ever something to suppress. The silence no longer needs guardians. It sustains itself. Within the church, this takes the form of selective continuity. Chronicles are copied and recopied, but only those sections that align with accepted theological arcs. Margins are trimmed. Ambiguities are clarified through exclusion rather than explanation. A monk tasked with preservation learns, often without instruction, which passages invite questions and which do not. Preservation becomes interpretation through absence. The sea remains a theological blind spot. Oceans do not fit easily into doctrines of authority. They resist enclosure. They refuse jurisdiction. By leaving them unexplored in sacred narrative, the Church avoids confronting spaces where divine order might appear without ecclesiastical structure. Silence becomes a way of keeping heaven properly aligned with altar and throne. Royal institutions refine a different technique. They normalize beginnings. Every empire prefers a clear first moment, an arrival, a flag, a proclamation. Anything prior is dismissed as myth or irrelevance. In this framework, earlier presence without claim becomes invisible by definition. If no crown sanctioned it, it did not count. This logic shapes education, cartography, and memory. Children are taught beginnings that serve continuity. Scholars are rewarded for reinforcing them. Over time, alternative sequences feel not threatening, but simply implausible. The mind resists what it has never been trained to imagine. Even when anomalies surface, they are absorbed without disruption. A coin found out of place, a carving that predates explanation, an unexplained accuracy in early maps. Each is addressed individually, never collectively. Fragmentation prevents synthesis. Synthesis would demand acknowledgement. This pattern is not unique to the Templars. It is how institutions survive across centuries. They do not erase inconvenient truths. They isolate them until they no longer form a narrative. What is remarkable in this case is how thoroughly the method succeeds. The idea of westward Templar movement fades not because it is disproven, but because it is never permitted to cohere. No single authority needs to deny it. The silence itself does the work. Maps, again, reveal the strategy most clearly. Early hints of knowledge beyond accepted bounds are replaced with speculation, then with certainty aligned to official discovery. The transition is smooth. No rupture announces it. Later generations cannot tell where ignorance ended and erasure began. To acknowledge prior guardianship beyond Europe would fracture authority in subtle ways. It would suggest that history unfolds without permission, that knowledge can move independently of power, that there are moments when restraint, rather than conquest, shapes the world. Such ideas do not serve empires. They do not serve institutions built on mediation and claim, and so they are allowed to dissolve. Yet within this silence, preservation occurs. By refusing to engage, institutions inadvertently protect what they ignore. The absence of official narrative leaves space for something to remain untouched. Had the Church condemned westward knowledge explicitly, it would have drawn seekers. Had crowns pursued missing fleets, they might have found traces. Silence prevents both. This is the paradox at the heart of institutional suppression. What is silenced too loudly becomes tempting. What is silenced quietly becomes forgotten, and forgotten things are often safest. There is also a deeper intuition at work. Both church and crown sense, perhaps unconsciously, that some truths are destabilizing not because they are false, but because they are simple. Simple truths bypass authority structures. They do not require sanction. They do not ask permission. Such truths undermine the need for intermediaries. By leaving the matter untouched, institutions maintain their role as necessary interpreters of history and meaning. The cost is a narrowing of narrative. The benefit is stability. As centuries pass, the silence becomes indistinguishable from fact. Students learn timelines without gaps. Maps display origins without ambiguity. The idea that something might have occurred quietly before official discovery feels unnecessary to consider. Yet the silence never fully seals. It hums faintly beneath the record. In the unease scholars feel when anomalies accumulate, in the way certain questions are avoided instinctively, in the sense that some doors once closed should not be reopened. This is not fear. It is institutional instinct. As this part draws toward its close, the silence feels less like suppression and more like a carefully maintained equilibrium. The story is sealed not with locks but with indifference perfected. And indifference over time becomes more effective than force. The truth remains unchallenged because it is uninvited, and uninvited truths endure quietly, beyond the reach of denial. There is a final stage to institutional silence, one that arrives only after generations have passed. At this stage, silence no longer feels imposed. It feels natural. The absence of certain questions becomes part of the intellectual landscape, like a path never taken because no one remembers it was once there. By the time the age of exploration dawns, the silence surrounding earlier westward knowledge is complete. Ships cross the Atlantic under royal banners, guided by charts declared new, and the world receives these voyages as beginnings. The language of discovery settles easily because nothing competes with it. What was once known quietly has been erased, so gently that even its erasure is forgotten. This is the moment when suppression becomes preservation in its most refined form. The Church blesses new lands without hesitation. The Crown claims them without fear of contradiction. The narrative proceeds cleanly, untroubled by questions of prior guardianship or earlier restraint. Authority remains intact because the past has been smoothed. And yet, traces remain, not in archives but in patterns, in the way certain regions are described with familiarity too early, in the confidence with which some routes are sailed, in the curious absence of surprise where wonder would be expected. These patterns pass unnoticed because they are never assembled into a whole. The silence does not erase memory entirely, it redistributes it. Fragments survive outside official channels where they cannot threaten coherence, in folklore, in anomalies, in instincts passed down without explanation. The institutions do not pursue these remnants because they no longer register as meaningful. What has been preserved, paradoxically, is possibility. By refusing to close the matter through denial, institutions leave it suspended, a door neither opened nor sealed. This suspension allows the truth to exist without confrontation. It is not validated, but neither is it destroyed. It simply remains elsewhere. This approach suggests an unspoken understanding that some histories are too destabilizing to integrate, but too enduring to eliminate. The safest course is to let them recede into irrelevance, to trust time to soften their edges until they no longer cut. The Templars, had they survived as an institution, might have recognized this strategy. It mirrors their own. Silence used not to deceive but to protect. Absence employed as a shield rather than a void. In this sense, institutional silence becomes an unintended ally to the original guardianship. What the temple hid deliberately, the Church and Crown preserve accidentally, not out of sympathy but out of self-interest. The result is the same. The knowledge remains unclaimed. As centuries pass, the silence grows comfortable. Scholars feel no urgency to challenge it. The questions it suppresses feel distant, abstract, unnecessary. History moves forward without looking sideways. Progress depends on momentum, not reflection. And yet beneath this calm surface, the silence hums, not loudly, not insistently. It hums like a memory half felt, a thought interrupted before it forms. Those who sense it rarely speak of it because sensing is not the same as knowing. Knowing would demand articulation. Articulation would invite consequence. So the silence remains intact. As this chapter closes, we understand that suppression here is not crude. It is elegant. It does not shout. It does not threaten. It simply declines to participate. By doing so, it allows what was hidden to remain hidden without the violence of denial. The story is sealed not by force but by consensus unspoken. A shared decision across institutions and centuries to let certain questions sleep. And in that sleep, the truth endures, not as fact, not as doctrine, but as presence just beyond reach, waiting not for revelation, but for alignment. The silence is complete, but it is not empty. We move now through geography, but not as travelers counting distance. This is not a journey measured in miles or days. It is a movement through echoes, through places that remember more than they record. The pilgrimage unfolds not on roads, but in alignment of fragments scattered far enough apart to appear unrelated, yet close enough to resonate. It begins at La Rochelle, where stone meets tide and history hesitates. The harbor stands open to the Atlantic, its walls shaped by centuries of departure. Here, absence speaks first. Ships once gathered, then vanished. Ledgers fall quiet. The place holds the memory of motion without destination. Even now, the water feels oriented outward, as though accustomed to releasing what must not return. From there, the trace bends south to Portugal. Along its coast, watchtowers face a sea that once promised danger more than opportunity. In these places, navigation matured early, quietly, without celebration. Techniques appear before their time. Charts feel practiced. Sailors speak of routes as if recalled rather than discovered. The land remembers waiting rather than arriving. Ireland follows not by proximity but by correspondence. Its western cliffs face the same ocean with a different temperament. Here, stone keeps counsel. Crosses appear where no parish claims them. Carvings align with horizons rather than altars. The edge of the land feels less like an end and more like a threshold. Stories persist of those who stood there briefly, looked west, and left without explanation. None of these places offer proof. Proof would require clarity. Clarity would demand conclusion. Instead, they offer fragments, each incomplete, each insufficient alone. A vanished fleet, a navigational instinct, a carving that does not belong. These fragments resist consolidation unless viewed together, and even then they refuse to resolve. The pilgrimage continues across the water, though no vessel is required to follow it. On the far western coasts, traces appear that answer questions asked elsewhere, markers that align with those left behind, practices that mirror restraint rather than conquest, memories that echo earlier movements without repeating them. This is not coincidence. Coincidence clusters randomly. These traces arrange themselves with intention, not enough to announce a path but enough to confirm one exists. The alignment is subtle, requiring patience to perceive. Those who rush past will see nothing. Those who linger may feel recognition without understanding why. What binds these places is not similarity but orientation. Each faces west. Each holds a posture of release rather than arrival. Each participates in a movement that passes through without settling. This is not the route of traders or colonizers. It is the route of those who know when to move on. The pilgrimage is symbolic because it does not demand participation. One does not need to visit these places to follow the path. One needs only to notice how they correspond, how silence repeats, how absence leaves shape, how memory survives without insistence. The path suggests intentional movement rather than accident. Accidents scatter. Intention aligns. The temple's disappearance did not dissolve into chaos. It distributed itself into places capable of holding quiet fragments. Each location became a vessel not for objects but for posture. As we trace this alignment, we begin to sense a larger pattern, not a map but a rhythm, a cadence of departure and restraint, a pilgrimage that does not seek a shrine but preserves a distance. This journey offers no destination. That is its discipline. It invites awareness rather than arrival. To follow it is not to reach a conclusion, but to recognize continuity where history insists on rupture. As this part closes, the path remains open but unmarked. It does not guide the feet. It guides the attention. Those who seek it directly will miss it. Those who allow it to emerge may find themselves already upon it without knowing when they began. The pilgrimage continues, not forward, not backward, but quietly through places that remember how to let things pass. To follow a pilgrimage of traces is to abandon the desire for arrival. Each place encountered offers only a portion, never the whole. This incompleteness is not a flaw. It is the design. A complete picture would invite possession. Fragments invite patience. From Portugal's southern capes, the trace curves again, not directly west but outward in suggestion. Sailors there long spoke of waters that felt familiar before they were charted, of currents known by instinct rather than record. These instincts were not taught formally. They were absorbed, like habits passed down without origin. Knowledge moved beneath language, protected by its own subtlety. The architecture along these coasts mirrors this restraint. Fortifications face inward more than outward. Chapels are placed where land meets uncertainty, not to command the sea but to acknowledge it. There is a sense that something once passed through here, briefly enough to leave posture behind, not structure. Further north, along Brittany's edges, the pilgrimage finds another echo. Standing stones face west with no explanation. Paths terminate at cliffs without warning. These are not destinations. They are pauses, places where movement slows, where one becomes aware of leaving rather than arriving. The land itself participates in the act of restraint. Ireland deepens this pattern. Its monasteries, perched near the Atlantic, are oriented not toward expansion but toward contemplation. Some seem deliberately unfinished, as if permanence were never intended. The monks who lived there spoke of other shores without urgency, without hunger. The phrase carried neither promise nor threat. It carried acceptance. Across the sea, the echoes answer. On western coasts unnamed for centuries, certain sites feel prepared rather than discovered. Natural harbors that offer shelter without invitation. Inland routes that guide movement gently away from sensitive areas. The land itself appears to cooperate with restraint. Those who come without conquest pass easily. Those who come to claim feel resistance without understanding why. This reciprocity between land and traveler is rare. It suggests prior relationship, not ownership but familiarity, a knowing of when to approach and when to withdraw. Such knowing does not arise spontaneously. It is learned, then remembered. The pilgrimage of traces reveals that memory is not centralized. It is distributed. Each place holds just enough to confirm what another implies. No location bears the burden of explanation alone. Together, they form a network of recognition rather than proof. This network resists mapping. Traditional maps demand boundaries and routes. This pilgrimage offers orientation without direction. It cannot be drawn without losing meaning. It must be sensed. Those who sense it often do so without context. A traveler feels unease in one place, calm in another. A historian notices patterns that refuse to align with official timelines. A sailor follows a current that feels older than charts. None of these experiences compel belief. They invite attention. The temple's movement did not carve a path through geography. It activated a resonance already present. The pilgrimage traces not where the Templars went, but where the world was capable of receiving them quietly. These places were predisposed to silence. Accident cannot account for such predisposition. Accident scatters without regard for suitability. Intention seeks environments that can hold purpose without exposure. The alignment of these places suggests selection, not chance. Yet the pilgrimage does not claim exclusivity. It does not belong to the temple alone. Others may have sensed these same alignments across time, interpreting them differently. What matters is not who recognized the path, but that the path remains subtle enough to resist domination. As centuries pass, the traces shift, ports expand, cliffs erode, cities rise where silence once prevailed. Still, the underlying pattern endures. It adapts. It hides within new forms. A harbor becomes busy, but certain routes remain avoided. A city grows, but certain stones remain untouched. This adaptability is the strength of the pilgrimage. It does not demand preservation in form. It requires only preservation of posture. As long as restraint survives somewhere, the path remains viable. As this part draws to a close, the sense of movement deepens. not toward revelation, but toward recognition. The pilgrimage teaches how to see continuity without insisting on narrative. It invites one to notice how the world collaborates in its own concealment. The traces do not point forward, they point across time, across intention, and those who follow them do not arrive, they align. A pilgrimage that remains unmarked depends on a final condition. It must never be completed. Completion invites summary. Summary invites ownership. Ownership invites closure. The pilgrimage of traces avoids all of these by refusing to resolve into destination or doctrine. As the fragments stretch across centuries, their arrangement becomes less visible, not more. New layers of history settle over old alignments. Cities grow where silence once prevailed. Maps are redrawn, then redrawn again. Yet beneath these changes, the posture persists. Certain movements remain hesitant. Certain questions remain unasked. Those who sense the pilgrimage do not follow it deliberately. Deliberate following would turn it into method. Instead, it emerges gradually, often without intention. A scholar notices an anomaly, then another, then stops short of synthesis. A traveler feels drawn to certain places without knowing why, then leaves before attachment forms. A community preserves a custom whose origin is forgotten but whose absence feels wrong. These moments are not coordinated. They do not form a movement. They form continuity. The path suggested by these traces is not linear. It bends, it loops, it disappears and reappears. It does not insist on progression. It insists on balance. Balance between knowledge and silence, between curiosity and restraint. The Templars, if they initiated this pattern, did not do so to create legacy. Legacy seeks remembrance. This pilgrimage seeks anonymity. It ensures that no single authority can gather all fragments at once. Anyone attempting to do so would need to cross disciplines, cultures, and eras, an effort unlikely to succeed without drawing attention. Attention itself would disrupt the posture required. This distributed structure explains why the idea resists proof. Proof requires convergence. Convergence would collapse the distance that keeps the fragments safe. By remaining separate, the traces protect one another. Even modern inquiry, with its hunger for synthesis, struggles here. Each fragment can be explained away individually. Only alignment reveals significance. But alignment requires patience, humility, and a willingness to leave conclusions unfinished. These are qualities rarely rewarded. The pilgrimage remains open because it is not owned. No institution claims it. No tradition codifies it. It survives precisely because it cannot be pointed to without dissolving. To say here is the path would be to mark it, and marking it would end it. Thus, the unmarked nature of the pilgrimage is not oversight. It is essence. As this chapter fades, we are left with a sense of motion without movement, of a journey that does not carry one forward but attunes one sideways to patterns that exist outside official sequence. The land, the sea, and the memory they carry cooperate in this quiet alignment. The path does not invite travelers. It invites awareness. Those who walk it do so without knowing they have begun. Those who reach for it directly will feel only emptiness. It reveals itself only to those who accept incompletion. And so the pilgrimage continues, not toward revelation, but toward continued obscurity. Its purpose is not to be followed to the end, but to remain possible. The traces remain. The alignment holds. The path stays open precisely because it is never named. Centuries later, sails rise again on the western horizon, and those who guide them believe themselves alone with destiny. They carry charters, blessings, and names prepared in advance. They speak of discovery with confidence as though the world had been waiting for their arrival. History will remember them as first. Yet upon landfall, something unsettles this certainty. The coast does not feel empty. Not inhabited in the way they understand, but receptive in a manner that suggests familiarity. Certain inlets offer shelter too readily. Certain paths inland seem already tested, already known. The land does not resist, but neither does it yield with surprise. It receives as one receives a return rather than an intrusion. Explorers note signs they cannot place. Markers worn smooth by time, too deliberate to be natural, too subtle to be understood. Stones aligned where no settlement stands. Clearings that feel intentional, though long reclaimed by growth. These details do not alarm them. They are dismissed as coincidence or attributed to peoples newly encountered. The idea that others may have passed through earlier is not considered seriously. More curious still is the knowledge these newcomers seem to possess before experience should allow it. Routes are chosen that avoid danger without explanation. Currents are followed with confidence not yet earned. Certain regions are approached cautiously as though guided by instinct rather than information. This familiarity feels inherited rather than acquired. It is not civilization they encounter. No ruins rise to challenge their claim. No cities demand acknowledgement. There is no empire to contest authority. What lingers instead is memory, diffused, understated, resistant to categorization. Memory that does not announce itself but shapes behavior. The presence reveals itself most clearly through absence. Questions that never fully close. Why does this river feel known before it is mapped? Why does this valley seem avoided without cause? Why do certain discoveries feel like confirmations rather than revelations? These questions surface briefly, then are set aside. There is too much ahead to dwell on unease. Structures do not testify to earlier arrival. Instead, there are gaps where structures might have been. A lack of contest where contest would be expected. The land seems prepared not for possession but for passage. This confounds the expectations of those trained to equate history with imprint. As settlements grow, this lingering presence recedes further. Memory becomes background. Familiarity dulls into assumption. The world begins to feel new again because the older layer withdraws politely. It does not compete. It waits. Yet traces persist. In the ease with which certain myths take root. In the readiness of some landscapes to absorb foreign systems without resistance. In the absence of shock that should accompany first contact. These subtleties never crystallize into argument. They simply remain as texture. Those who arrive later inherit this softened world without knowing why it feels navigable. They benefit from a prior restraint they never witnessed. The land accepts them not because it is conquered, but because it has already learned how to remain intact. As this chapter opens, we begin to sense that discovery did not begin history here. It entered an ongoing memory, a memory that had already decided how much of itself to reveal. The new world does not feel empty, it feels patient. And patience, unlike novelty, suggests something has been here before. As settlement expands and maps fill with names, the sense of prior presence does not disappear. It softens. It adjusts its position, moving from the surface into the seams of experience. Those who arrive later inherit a world already arranged for endurance, though no one tells them why it feels so. The familiarity they encounter is not taught. It is felt. Forests open where passage is easiest. Rivers guide movement inland with unexpected cooperation. Harbors offer shelter where it would seem least likely. These conveniences are attributed to fortune, to divine favor, to the natural generosity of land. Rarely is it considered that the land has been approached before with restraint rather than demand. Explorers record what they see, not what they sense. Their journals describe flora, fauna, coastlines, encounters. They do not record the absence of resistance, the lack of disorientation, the quiet readiness of terrain. Such things feel too abstract to note. And yet, these are the signs of memory at work. In certain regions, settlers remark upon places that feel set apart without obvious cause. Groves avoided by instinct. Hills left undeveloped despite advantage. Caves entered once, then abandoned without explanation. These hesitations are not codified. They are personal, fleeting, and therefore unchallenged. Over time, they become communal habits. Areas remain untouched because no one ever feels compelled to touch them. This avoidance does not arise from fear. There are no legends warning of danger. There is simply a lack of invitation. The land does not call attention to itself. It offers no promise of gain. In a world driven by acquisition, such places fade from interest naturally. The lingering presence also expresses itself in stories that feel unfinished, tales of travelers who sense something watching, not with hostility, but with indifference, accounts of markers discovered and then forgotten, observations that never quite form conclusions. These narratives circulate briefly, then dissolve into the broader flow of settlement life. What persists most clearly is a sense of alignment. Certain discoveries feel inevitable rather than accidental, as though paths taken were already cleared by decision rather than chance. This does not trouble the newcomers. Inevitability feels reassuring. It supports the belief that history moves forward as it should, yet inevitability is often the residue of prior choice. The absence of visible predecessors allows the illusion of novelty to flourish. Without ruins to confront them, settlers assume originality. Without records to contradict them, they believe themselves first. The earlier presence remains invisible precisely because it left nothing to argue with. This invisibility is its success. Memory that leaves no monuments does not provoke competition. It does not invite comparison. It does not demand recognition. It shapes without confronting. It influences without insisting. Such memory is resilient. Over generations, the sense of something prior thins further. It becomes mood rather than knowledge, atmosphere rather than account. The new world feels less mysterious and more manageable, but certain questions never fully close. Why did this place feel ready? Why did this route succeed where others failed? Why do some names settle easily while others feel forced? These questions remain unanswered not because they are forbidden, but because they are unnecessary to progress. Progress requires momentum, not reflection. The world rewards forward motion, not backward inquiry. And so the lingering presence becomes part of the foundation upon which new histories are built. It does not interrupt. It supports quietly like an unseen frame. Those who benefit from it rarely notice it exists. The memory does not seek to return. It does not reassert itself. It does not compete with the noise of settlement and growth. It remains where it was placed, beneath attention, beneath record, beneath desire. As this part draws to a close, we sense that the new world's apparent readiness was not coincidence. It was the outcome of an earlier encounter that chose restraint over imprint, a choice that allowed the land to remain open without becoming empty. The presence lingers not as a shadow, but as an absence that shapes movement. Not as a claim, but as a quiet permission that was granted once and never revoked. As centuries pass, the idea of firstness settles into certainty. Textbooks, monuments, and anniversaries harden the narrative. Discovery becomes an event with a date, a name, a direction. The earlier sense of unease fades into background noise, no longer noticed even by those who once felt it. And yet, the lingering presence never fully dissolves. It survives in contradictions, in discoveries that feel anticlimactic, in moments when expectation outpaces experience. Explorers write of reaching places long imagined, only to find them strangely familiar, as if anticipation itself had memory. This familiarity is rarely examined. It is accepted as intuition or dismissed as imagination. The presence also survives in the land's response to occupation. Some places absorb change readily, reshaping themselves without protest. Others resist subtly, refusing permanence. Settlements fail without clear reason. Roads fall out of use. Names do not endure. These failures are attributed to climate, to chance, to error. The possibility of inherited restraint is never considered. Memory, when it lingers this way, becomes ambient. It does not inform decisions directly. It influences them indirectly, shaping outcomes without revealing cause. This is why it remains difficult to locate. It has no center. It cannot be traced to a single source. It is distributed across experience. What once existed as guardianship now exists as atmosphere. The absence of structures is key. Structures invite analysis. Ruins demand interpretation. Their absence leaves nothing to interrogate. Without something to point at, inquiry dissolves into speculation, and speculation rarely alters consensus. The lingering presence also reveals itself through what never quite arrives. Certain anticipated revelations do not materialize. Certain expected conflicts fail to occur. The land, despite immense change, retains pockets of inexplicable quiet. These pockets persist across eras, resisting incorporation into grand narratives. Those who encounter them often describe a sense of interruption, not fear, not awe, but pause. A feeling that something has already been accounted for, that the place does not require further assertion. Such feelings are deeply personal and therefore easily dismissed. Yet across many individuals, across time, they accumulate. The new world begins to feel less new and more remembered. Not remembered by people, but remembered by itself, as though the land holds a prior acknowledgement that continues to shape what follows. This does not challenge discovery outright. It simply reframes it as one layer among others. The idea that memory can exist without record unsettles modern assumptions. We are taught to trust what can be written, built, dated. But the lingering presence resists all three. It exists without form. It influences without appearing. This may be why the idea remains difficult to discuss. It offers no artifact to analyze, no timeline to defend. It asks instead for attentiveness to absence, to what does not insist on being seen. As this chapter closes, the realization settles gently, that the new world's apparent openness was not emptiness but preparedness. A preparedness shaped by an earlier passage that left no mark visible enough to contest. The world did not wait to be discovered. It waited to be approached again. And the memory of that earlier approach, restrained, custodial, quiet, continues to soften the edges of history, reminding us that not all beginnings are beginnings and not all firsts are first. The presence remains, not as claim, not as proof, but as a question that never fully closes, resting beneath the certainty of arrival, patient enough to endure being overlooked. And so the chronicle softens, not because it weakens, but because it no longer needs to insist. What has been carried this far does not demand conclusion. It asks only for rest. The narrative loosens its grip on sequence and proof, allowing meaning to drift where certainty once pressed. There is no final evidence offered here, no artifact raised as decisive, no declaration carved into stone. Such gestures belong to conquest, not to remembrance. What remains instead is a widening sense that the world has always been broader than the histories permitted to survive, and quieter than the stories told by those who claimed it. If the Templars crossed the Western Sea before it bore a name, they did so without witnesses because witnesses change intention. To be seen is to be interpreted. To be interpreted is to be claimed. The Temple understood this well enough to refuse the entire process. Their movement westward was not an announcement, but a withdrawal from announcement itself. They did not go to be remembered. Memory attracts inquiry. Inquiry attracts disturbance. They went to protect something that could not survive attention. Whether that something was a place, a knowledge, a balance, or simply the possibility of restraint, it required obscurity to endure, and obscurity was achieved. What survives now is not a fact to be argued, but an atmosphere to be entered. A feeling that some truths remain intact precisely because they were never resolved. The mystery remains alive because it was meant to. Closure would have ended its usefulness. Openness allows it to persist. The unnamed has always been safer than the named. Names fix boundaries. They turn landscapes into possessions and ideas into doctrines. By leaving the Western lands unnamed in their passage, the Templars ensured that no single authority could gather all the threads and bind them into certainty. History prefers conclusions. It rewards those who finish stories, but sacred history, history for sleep, understands another rhythm. It understands that some stories must fade gently, like embers settling into ash, still warm enough to feel but no longer bright enough to draw crowds. The chronicle therefore does not end. It quiets. The fragments we have followed, absence, maps without legends, witnesses without names, fleets that vanish, landfalls without claim, guardians who withdraw, institutions that fall silent, traces that align, presence that lingers. None of these resolve into proof. Together they form something else, coherence without captivity. This coherence does not ask to be believed. It asks to be held lightly, like a memory recalled just before sleep, when certainty relaxes and possibility widens. In that state, the question of whether it happened becomes less important than the sense that it could have, and that its having happened changed the world quietly. If the Templars succeeded, their success lies here, in a mystery that does not provoke pursuit, in a silence that does not feel empty, in a guardianship so complete it no longer requires guardians to be visible. The world moved on, empires rose, maps filled, names multiplied, and yet beneath all of it, something remained untouched. A space that history learned not to disturb because it never learned how to see it. Now, as the telling slows, there is nothing left to prove, only something left to feel, a widening calm, a sense that not all truths belong to daylight, that some are meant for the hour when attention softens and defenses fall away. Rest now within that silence. Let the unanswered remain unanswered. Let the unnamed remain unnamed. The guardians do not require acknowledgement. They have already done what was asked of them. They still walk unseen, not forward, not backward, but alongside as they always have. Silence, when allowed to deepen, becomes shelter. It gathers what has been scattered and lays it down gently, without arrangement, without demand. In this shelter, the chronicle releases its need to persuade. What remains is presence, soft, unassertive, enduring. There is a moment, often unnoticed, when a story ceases to move forward and begins to settle inward. This is that moment. The fragments no longer seek alignment. They rest where they are, sufficient in their distance from one another. The mind no longer tries to gather them. It allows them to remain as they arrived. The world, viewed from this quiet, appears altered. Not reshaped, but re-understood. The oceans feel less like barriers and more like pauses between thoughts. The land feels less like possession and more like participant. History itself loosens, no longer insisting on linear order. If the Templars crossed before the world had a name for what lay beyond the sea, then they crossed into a space that did not yet belong to narrative. That space was not empty. It was simply unclaimed by explanation. To move through, it required restraint rather than ambition. What they did there did not echo loudly enough to fracture time. It left no monuments to demand attention. It left no wounds to provoke memory. It left only balance, maintained long enough for the world to forget it had ever been threatened. This may be the truest measure of success. Not that something was built, but that something was allowed to remain. In a world shaped by conquest, restraint is invisible. Its victories leave no ruins. The institutions that followed, crowns, churches, empires, did not undo this act. They passed over it. Their power expanded elsewhere, where claim was easier, where resistance was louder. The quiet spaces were left intact because they offered no immediate reward. Over time, the unnamed spaces became fewer, but not fewer enough to disappear. They shifted. They adapted. They learned how to remain unnoticed within the noise of progress. The guardianship did not oppose history. It learned how to hide inside it. This is why the mystery persists without agitation. It does not demand revision. It does not threaten collapse. It coexists with accepted narratives like a second current beneath the surface, altering direction without breaking the flow. Those who sense it rarely speak of it. Speech would sharpen it. Sharpened things invite use. Instead, it is felt as a soft hesitation, a sense that something is already accounted for, that not everything requires explanation. In the hour when attention loosens, this feeling grows clearer. When the need to categorize fades, the presence becomes gentle rather than elusive. It does not ask to be understood. It asks only to be allowed. The chronicle now behaves the same way. It steps back. It does not argue for itself. It does not insist on relevance. It simply remains open enough to be remembered, quiet enough to be forgotten again. This is the rhythm of sacred history, not accumulation but release, not conquest but care, not illumination but glow. The world does not need to know what was protected in order to benefit from its protection. It only needs to continue, and it has. As this part draws toward its end, the sense of guardianship dissolves further into atmosphere. The watchers are no longer imagined as figures or orders. They become conditions, ways of being, habits of restraint that survive without instruction. The mystery does not fade because it is unresolved. It fades because it has fulfilled its function. It no longer needs to be carried forward consciously. It has been folded into the fabric of how the world learned to remain open without being consumed. And so the chronicle slows again, not to stop, not to conclude, but to rest where unanswered questions belong. In the end, what remains is not an answer but a hush, a gentle lowering of thought like a tide receding without spectacle. The chronicle does not close its eyes. It simply loosens its focus, allowing what has been carried to settle where it belongs. There is no final summation because summation gathers and binds. What has been traced here resists binding. It prefers to remain dispersed, like stars whose meaning emerges only when not forced into shape. Each fragment retains its distance, its dignity, its right to remain incomplete. The world seen from this quiet feels less owned, less defined. Its edges soften. Its past stretches further back than record, and its future extends without obligation to repeat what came before. In this widening, the need to know gives way to the ability to rest with not knowing. If the Templars crossed the sea before it bore a name, their crossing did not fracture history. It did not announce a new age. It slipped between ages, touching lightly and withdrawing before consequence could gather. What they guarded was not meant to be carried forward in triumph. It was meant to remain where it was, protected by being left alone. And it was. The mystery endures because it was never meant to be solved. Solved mysteries become possessions. Possessions invite conflict. This mystery was shaped instead to remain alive, to breathe quietly beneath certainty, to remind without instructing, to persist without demanding. In this way, the unnamed proves stronger than the named. The unseen outlasts the monumental. The whispered carries further than the proclaimed. Sacred history has always understood this, even when official history has not. There is a moment just before sleep when the mind releases its grip on sequence. Thoughts drift without urgency. Images soften. Questions lose their sharpness. In that moment, truth does not disappear. It becomes gentle enough to approach without defense. This chronicle belongs to that moment. It does not ask you to remember details. It does not require belief. It offers only a sense that something quiet moved through the world once, carefully enough to leave it open, and wise enough to leave it unnamed. The guardians do not stand watch in any visible way. They do not patrol borders or preserve relics. They exist now as posture rather than presence, as the instinct to pause before claiming, as the hesitation to name what feels complete without explanation. They walk unseen not because they hide, but because there is nothing left to point at. Their work has been absorbed into silence. Silence, once cultivated long enough, no longer feels empty. It feels full without being crowded. And so the telling fades not into darkness but into rest. The sea continues its breathing. The land keeps its patience. History moves forward unaware of what it has passed over. Nothing stirs. Nothing concludes. Only the sense remains that the world was wider than it admitted and quieter than conquest required. That something precious was protected not by force but by restraint. That what endures longest is often what refuses to be named. You are not meant to carry this further. You are not meant to resolve it. Let it settle. Let it dim. The unnamed does not ask for witnesses. It asks only to remain, and it has.